Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. We are going to talk about executive function and anger, and our special guest is Dr. Ryan Martin. But before we get started, I just wanted to kind of set the stage about why anger and why anger with respect to executive function is an important topic for us to talk about. In 2015 at the White House Correspondents Dinner, something hilarious transpired. President Obama invited Luther, his anger translator, on the stage with him, and the comedian Keegan-Michael Key obliged. The tongue-in-cheek display of Obama's true frustrations expressed through Luther was not only ironic but brilliant, reminding us all that we all need an anger handler, so to speak. So let me ask you this. Have you ever woken up in the morning with a foul mood or gotten mad or even lost your mind? The good news is that you're neither unique or abnormal. The secret to managing anger is to know that to get angry is human, but to not react to your anger state is sublime. So today, it's my pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Ryan Martin. He's a researcher and the one who writes on healthy and unhealthy expression of anger. His book, Why We Get Mad, How to Use Your Anger for Positive Change, explores why people become angry, some of the common consequences of anger, and how people can use their anger in productive ways. Ryan is also host of a popular psychology podcast called Psychology and Stuff. Absolutely fabulous. You must listen. He was trained as a counseling psychologist at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he first started studying anger after earning his undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in criminal justice from the University of St. Thomas. He has worked with clients, angry and otherwise. I love that description when he says that, in a variety of settings, including community mental health centers, college counseling centers, and VA hospitals. Finally, he is a professor of psychology and an associate dean at College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. So with that, he has lots of wonderful contributions in many platforms. And one of the coolest things about him, which I don't see very often with many psychologists, is he's on TikTok, and it's absolutely worth listening to. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the really warm and kind introduction.
Absolutely. Since we're going to talk about executive function and frustration and negative emotions, let's first begin and set the stage for anger. So after reading your book, I had an epiphany. Anger needs a reputation management.
Yeah.
There are so many myths about anger that need clarification. So for starters, do you mind telling us a little bit about how you define anger as an emotion, and why do we get angry?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I think anger has a really terrible reputation. And I think part of the reason it has such a bad reputation is because people have confused it with some related concepts. And I think the most notable is aggression. People confuse anger, the emotion, with aggression, the behavior. And so I'm actually going to start there and say aggression is a behavior, and it can be verbal or physical, where you have the intent to hurt someone else. And that's very different from the emotion of anger, which is basically the emotional desire to lash out. It's an emotional response to injustice, to having your goals blocked, to unfair or unkind treatment. And the emotion is not only normal, it's healthy. It makes sense that we would become angry. In fact, it even makes sense that we might become angry relatively often, depending on our circumstances. If we are routinely exposed to unfair treatment, if we're routinely exposed to unfair barriers, it would make sense to become angry. But as you said in your introduction, and what I really, really liked, it's normal to feel that way, but how we manage it, what we do with it, how we express it, that is a very different story. And when we express it in aggressive ways, we oftentimes do ourselves and do others around us a disservice.
And thank you for setting the stage, because I think it's so important, as you mentioned, people are so hyper focused on the way anger is exhibited, and but that aggression, physical or emotional or in verbose ways, is actually an acting on that anger. Can you quickly talk about, because my perception before I read, and I do a lot of training that where we talk about fairness as a genuine human need to be treated fairly and to be perceived to be worthy of that fair treatment. And the goal blocking was an interesting component that you talked about. So that poor treatment and fairness and goal block. So some of the how can you give our audience an example of all three? How would they manifest in everyday experience?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked, because I think we can look at these categories that I just described, these types of provocations that I just described, and we can actually kind of break them up into, well, there's a lot of categories there. I might actually put them into two primary categories. So there's the unfair treatment and injustice. There's that category, and then the other side is what I would call that goal blocking category. And these two things actually can feel very different from one another. So the unfair treatment, the injustice, and the thing I like about talking about this is that they can be sort of big, significant experiences. I mean, racism, sexism, bullying, these are big issues of unfair treatment, of injustice that people can be responding to. But it can also be, smaller things. It can be the kid who picks on the other kid at camp. It can be these other examples that we deal with day in and day out that might not be tied to some of these larger systemic problems. And the same is true with something like goal blocking. Goal blocking can be anything from, my career is not progressing as I want it to I can't find my car keys this morning. And so it's this thing of I want to accomplish something and something is in my way. I have a goal and something is interfering. And when we face those types of provocations, big or small or either category, we end up becoming angry as a result. But it's not just those. And one of the things I talk about in my book is that it's not just the being exposed to these things or encountering these types of provocations. It's also our mood at the time that we experience or encounter those provocations. It's how we interpret them, how we think about those provocations, what they mean to us in our lives. And those three things essentially interact and give rise to those angry feelings.
So I guess confession time. I can tell. I think I get my knickers get tied in a knot when I see injustice in others. Other people being treated with unfairness. I'm doing better job, to be honest with you. Poor treatment of me, I'm able to let it kind of roll over my shoulder. But I'm really get upset when there's a goal blockage. And it's a funny thing, as you have lots of wonderful examples. But I think simple thing is standing in line and then somebody decides to pull out their checkbook. You're like, come on, or somebody comes to the checkout line and they can't find their wallet in in their massive purse. Those are the kinds of things I can see getting really irritated. So one thing, one of the very interesting thing recently I've been pondering over, the work that neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett did, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are. She in her research says that emotions are really guesses that your brain constructs in the moment, and you have more control over those guesses than you might imagine to do. But these guesses are projections about what you are anticipating. So does that apply to, which is a very different way of thinking about emotions, because you think you are reacting to something that happened. So do you see that framework applying to anger?
Absolutely. I think it's a really important point. That it's one of the things psychologists sometimes discuss, and I think back to my background when I was learning, when I was training to be a counseling psychologist. I had one of my professors was a constructivist. That was his theoretical orientation, which means that we interpret our own realities as we're going through the day. And one of the things we often talk about is, well, but is there an objective reality? Like there's a thing that happens, right? A thing that we are experiencing that happened in the world. And, my take on this is, yes, there's an objective thing that happened, but we also interpret that thing through a particular lens, and we bring to any situation that we're in, we bring into it a bunch of expectations based on past experience about how other people are going to behave, why they're behaving that way, what they're going to do, what they did, and then we interpret that and we make a decision about what it means to us. And I do think that the idea that essentially our emotions are the result of us guessing what things mean is accurate. And I also think it's worth noting that some people are probably better guessers than others.
Yes.
And so, you might be right about what that thing means. And so I should say too, your example about goal blocking, I think is a great one. It's one that I experience all the time too. Is that, and part of it is because who I am and what I value. I do put a high priority on my time.
Yes.
I'm a pretty busy person. I try to get a lot done, and it's important to me that I can be as efficient as possible. And so when I am slowed down and it's not real, it's unexpected, I'm more likely to get angry. And so all these little things that happen in our day, and anything from the example you gave to my computer, not starting as fast as I want it to, or like I said, difficulty finding my car keys, or my kids taking too long to get out
Yes.
to the car. All of those are examples of things that, and it's what's particularly funny about it is if I really stop myself and think about it and realize, that only cost me about 30 seconds, right? That's not gonna break my day. That's not gonna be the reason I don't get something done. But it's really easy in that moment to sort of lose control of our thoughts and think, oh no, I've got this is going to ruin everything, right? Because of this, I'm going to be behind on this, and I really need to get to this, and now this has happened, right? And it all escalates, and we catastrophize the outcome of that to the point that we become angrier than we probably should.
Yeah, and I think the part that I also really spoke to me was the goal pursuit. The idea that I talk a lot in my work about collaborative goal pursuit. So as I'm in pursuit of my goals, if I begin to pause and take a perspective of the other and recognize you too are in goal pursuit. So if I do some introspection and say, am I coming in the way of you pursuing your goals? And if that perspective, by creating this argument now, I may be blocking you because I'm already mad that you blocked my goals. And then now two miserable people. So that has really helped me also to kind of allow that moment that it's a temporary blockage. It's not permanent blockage. That really helps too.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some concepts that you have developed and talk about this diagramming anger. And so which kind of has these parts to anger, stages of anger, I guess. Can you talk about that and help us understand? Because not all goal blockages lead to feeling angry. Some we kind of accept and some we don't.
Right. Yeah. So I think, it really goes back to something you said at the start, which is I think a lot of people think that the way to deal with anger is as part of it having a bad reputation, is to sort of manage it through deep breathing, manage it through yoga or things like that, approaches to relax. And of course, those strategies are valuable and can be valuable and are things that we can absolutely do when we're feeling when we're feeling angry. But what I like to encourage people to do is sort of back up a little bit and take a look at the situation more broadly and think about those different elements that I described. So the provocation, what is the thing that is quote unquote making you mad? What is the thing that's happened? And to really sort of break down what type of provocation it is, what it means to you, and so on. I encourage people to think about what I call the pre-anger state. That's your mood at the time of that provocation. So were you fatigued? Were you hungry? Were you already angry about something, stressed, and so on? I can tell you one of my examples of this is I'll come back to it in a second. But when I'm running low on gas, this is a pre-anger state for me.
Okay.
So, but then the third element is our appraisal. It's how we interpret that precipitant. What is it, or that provocation? What does it mean to us? Is this I guess the worst thing that's ever happened? Are we catastrophizing? Are we labeling the people we are interacting with in negative ways? Are we what we call overgeneralizing, where we say, oh, this is the worst thing that's ever, where we say like, oh, this always happens to me, or things never go my way, that sort of thing. And those give rise to these angry feelings, this physiological, psychological, cognitive state that where we get mad. And then even from that point, we can talk about, well, what do we do when we get mad? And by diagramming an angry incident, what I really am encouraging people to do is to think about all of those elements and then think about where they can intervene. Because we can choose sometimes what provocations we face. We can choose how we go into those provocations, how we experience them. We can address some of those pre-anger state things. We can try and avoid some of the mood states that lead to anger. We can certainly think about how we're thinking about things, and so on. And so, for me, an example of this is I'm a relatively relaxed driver, and the reason I'm relatively relaxed is because, and by relaxed I mean not angry. I'm probably a scared driver. That's probably true, but I think that when I go when I'm driving places, I don't tend to get too angry with people, and part of that is because I allow myself lots of time. I don't sort of get myself into situations where I am going to feel frantic or stressed. One mistake I sometimes make, though, is that I let myself get low on gas, and when I do, I become much more sort of frantic. Every delay, every red light, every slow driver becomes me thinking, oh, this is going to be the reason why I run out of gas. And then I'm going to be stuck on the side of the road, and I'm going to have to, call AAA, or I'm going to have to walk to the gas station, and so all of a sudden these catastrophic thoughts come out that I have essentially, created by letting myself get into this situation, by letting myself get into that state. And once I realized that, I just stopped ever letting myself get there. I just said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to always make sure I get gas. And as long as I do, I should be fine.
I love that example. And I think driving, it's COVID just gave a little anger break, I feel, but nobody having to drive.
Right.
But in preparation for this talk, I did a little survey in my friend circle and my children who drive, and one of the funny things, my son said that he and his girlfriend, one of the issues of contention is the driving quality of each other. So apparently my son was saying his girlfriend says that thinks that he drives really poorly, like aggressively, and so he turns to me and says, and this is a person who has received 3 tickets for slow driving. And so I guess the criticism about each other's driving is kind of an anger. But I wanted to actually also share another. I took your advice and did diagram the anger in one of the shows, or many shows I've been watching, or TV or real life. And one particular show I was watching was a Stateless. And this is an air hostess or air flight attendant who comes home, and she's about to come home for holidays. And you can see she gets out of the car and she's already sweating. She's like wiping her brow and she's feeling really tense. So that's the pre-anger state. Then the minute she walks in, she gives a hug and kiss to her mom. And of course, that proximity, mom alludes that I think you should take a shower. So that's the precipitant mom criticizing her, and without criticizing, saying that probably you smell. And then I think she doesn't do appraisal, and then I'm fine, mom. You can see the sternness, and then when it comes to at dinner time, there's explosion. So the angry feelings are simmering, and then there's expression of anger, which is like she flings the plate. So it's so interesting that I think most people do that interact with other people's anger or your own once it gets expressed, but nobody really takes the time to evaluate the pre-anger state. So can you talk a little bit about the conditions that contribute to favorable or unfavorable pre-anger states?
Yeah, and I think this is really important because I do think we let ourselves, by not really taking care of ourselves, um, be fall into some of these situations and states where we are more likely to become angry. And of course, I want to be clear, some of it's unavoidable. And I'll also even add, it comes from sort of a privileged place to be able to even talk about some of this or think about some of this, because I don't have to deal with food insecurity, and I am able to sleep in a comfortable space and things like that. But I do think there is something to be said for being aware of what our bodies and minds need throughout our day to keep us from getting to that point where we are more likely to explode because we are hungry, tired, stressed, anxious, already angry, and so on. And so I think that attending to those needs is really, really important. And I also think we can, in many ways, attend to the needs of those around us, those we're interacting with too. And so, if I know, for instance, that my spouse is more likely to get angry when she's feeling stressed, I can help, I guess, navigate that with her. I can remind her in moments of stress that, I bet you're feeling really anxious right now. And just those reminders can make a difference in people's lives. When people become aware that that thing is sort of feeding into their interpretation or their experience of emotions, I think they become better able to handle those things. What's so funny about this to me is that any parent will tell you that their kids were much more difficult when they were hungry or tired. Yet with adults, we somehow sort of feel like, well, no, that went away. That's no longer a problem. But of course, it's still a problem. We have all sorts of evidence that says that if we don't take care of some of those basic needs, people get cranky the same way they used to.
And also, what I loved about that, the way to think about in an organized or way, step by step, is the pre-anger state is that perception that this situation is not going to go favorably for me because of my past knowledge or past experiences. I see a lot of kids getting into a difficult subject or with a difficult teacher already bringing an attitude, in quotes. But it's not an attitude, it's an anticipation of failure, anticipation of roadblocks. And to deal with it, then more and more difficult somebody gets, more stricter you get, which is exactly opposite of what you want. I'm curious, would it be good, like taking that example of my son who says his girlfriend has tickets for slow driving and she thinks he drives fast when he thinks he's driving normal. Is there a good way to manage that pre-anger state when, like, they get into the car and say, hey, we're going for a long drive, 3.5 hours. I know you feel I drive fast, but I feel you drive slow. How can we handle? Is there like a good way to tackle that pre-anger state? Right, nip it in the bud.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what you just described is can be a really good way, which is to sort of set those expectations ahead of time. And in a case like that, it might be um, both of you sort of agreeing or trying to come up with an agreed upon speed limit. And I don't know how formal people want to make this, but if you say like, hey, are you okay with 5 over the speed limit, or are you okay with 7 over, or something like that? And if you can come to that agreement and sort of essentially decide this is what we're good with, then you have that to fall back on throughout, because I think that the interesting thing about that example is, and it really speaks to one of the reasons why human beings become angry with others so often, is that we operate in a world with tons and tons and tons of unwritten rules, right? That we, even the example you described before about someone taking out their checkbook and writing a check, that there's an unwritten rule there. Are people supposed to use checks anymore
Yes.
for things like that? Is cash okay? Should we always be using credit cards? Are credit cards slow? Maybe we should be using, our phones to pay for things. And so all of those are these sorts of rules that people have set up or have decided what is or is not appropriate, much like the speed on the highway, right? Which I know there's a written rule,
Yes.
right? I mean, there's a number we're supposed to go, but everybody avoids it. And the question is, how much do we avoid it? And I think those things exist throughout our day, and they become fodder for people to become angry. Am I allowed to stop on an escalator, or should I keep walking? Right? That's a rule at the airport that people have, is whether or not you're allowed to do that. And if I stop, I've made the people behind me angry. If I keep going, I might make the person standing there ahead of me angry. So what are those rules? And I think that they exist everywhere. You see them and find them throughout in ways you probably didn't know existed.
Yes, yes. Now talking about your contribution to the field is the scale you developed, the angry cognition scale. And it's so remarkable. You talk about 5 distinct processes, cognitive processes, and you kind of refer to them as you introduce the concept of, the stages of anger. So this is about appraisal. Can we do a little deep dive about the misattribution of causation, catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, demandingness, and inflammatory labeling? So these are really complicated. Do you mind quickly giving us how we do this and why we need to understand them?
Yeah, so these are 5 types of thoughts that have been described by anger researchers before me and other than me, as essentially leading to or primary reasons why people become angry as part of that appraisal process. And so there are, of course, others. And frankly, even if you look at the literature, you'll find these same thoughts, but with different names. So, for example, demandingness is sometimes referred to as other directed shoulds. Black and white dichotomous thinking is sometimes referred to as black and white thinking, and so on. And so,
Yeah, and I have had.
let's go through them. So,
No, I was just going
go
to
ahead.
say I've had David Burns, who defines 10 cognitive distortions in his work of a team-based CBT approach. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's all right, and there's definitely more, especially when we start thinking about other emotions. And one of the things, because one of the things that's not listed in the anger literature really is something like self-directed shoulds, right? But that's going to be much more relevant in terms of something like sadness or something like anxiety, even, or guilt. So when we think about anger and we talk about these 5, one of the biggies is what we call misattributing causation, and really what it means is that when something happens, you misunderstand the cause, or you attribute the cause to the wrong person, or maybe for the wrong reasons. And so the example I have for this is a friend of mine. We're out bowling one night. He goes to pay, and I don't remember the details, but basically he gave the guy a 20 and the guy gave him a change as though we'd given him a 10. And the interaction went like this. My friend said, "Oh, I gave you a 20." And the guy said, "Oh, sorry about that," and gave him $10 back. And I thought it was over. And then my friend spent the rest of the night fuming about how this guy tried to rip him off. And so here's the same interaction. My interpretation is honest mistake. His interpretation is, no, that guy tried to rip me off, right? So one of us is misattributing causation there. One of us is misunderstanding what actually happened. Sometimes, so we can think things are an accident. We can think things are when they're really on purpose, and vice versa. We can also just attribute causation to the wrong person. We can think that so and so did something when in reality it was another person altogether who did it. So that's misattributing causation. Overgeneralizing is the tendency to use word to sort of label things in really broad global ways. So this always happens to me. Things never go my way. You hit a red light and you say, "Oh, I always hit every red light." That's a really different, type of thought than I hit more red lights than I'd like, or even I hit this red light, right? You take, or this is going to slow me down. You take a particular instance and you blow it up into a pattern. Well, of course, you're going to get more angry about a pattern. So we can think about this in terms of coworkers, right? Coworker doesn't respond to an email, and instead of saying, "Oh, I wish they'd respond," it's, "Oh, she never responds," right? That becomes a much bigger, broader problem at that point. Demandingness is the tendency to essentially put your needs over the needs of other people. It's a tendency to think that other people should sort of serve you in some ways. So we go back to that same email example. You want a response, so therefore in your mind, that coworker should drop everything they're doing and respond to you, right? And you're forgetting that they might have their own work responsibilities, their own things they're trying to get done, their own need for a vacation even, right? All of those things could also be important, but you've put your own needs over theirs. And we see this a lot with people and working with and getting frustrated with service providers and so on. Inflammatory labeling is the tendency to label people in these really negative ways, right? This is where a lot of foul language comes into play. It's the tendency to, you're driving down the street and someone makes a mistake and you say, "Oh, that person's a total idiot," or "That person's a total hazard." And you might fail to recognize that they could just be a really smart person who made a mistake, or they could be regularly a safe driver who made a mistake. And so you start responding to them as that label instead of as a human being, And then the last one, and I saved this one for last because it's in some ways we draw a distinction between what we call primary appraisal and secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisal is our ability to cope with the things in our lives, the problems that happen. And catastrophizing, this fifth type, is really about secondary appraisal. It's about your ability to cope with the bad things that happen. Because if something happens to you and you say, "Oh, that's bad, it's unfair," but it's not that big a deal, you're probably not going to get angry. If you say, "Oh, it's bad, it's unfair, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and it's going to ruin my career," well, then you're going to get angry. And so that tendency to catastrophize is really about blowing things out of proportion and so on.
Wow. And I've been victim of and recipient of other people's misinterpretations. You know what I really like? I really love the concept of that demandingness that you were talking about. I think the type A people, high achievers, trying to get their business done. We are so in a rush to serve our goals and almost expect the world to be serving our needs and respond in a way that's very fast and swift and without any blockage. So really, I think and if I may interject with this idea that I see I'm going through mindfulness meditation teacher training program myself, but I was born and raised in India and a great background in mindfulness as a culture. And now I see people's quick relationship to these mindfulness practices is, let's just take a breath and let's just be mindful. But there has to be cultural mindfulness too. You have to have a culture where you allow people to go ahead of you on a stoplight without honking at them, or letting somebody cut a line, like just being much more generous. And I feel we are not. We are just breathing harder, but we are not generous. so, so the anger is just seething.
Yes.
It's temporarily, kind of hidden, so to
Uh,
speak.
I think that's a really, really great point. I mean, I think what is, I think I think most people who know me know this about me, that I am really in many ways as type A as it gets. I mean, that I have systems for everything. I am painfully organized. I'm super competitive. I'm all of these things that should make me as angry and even aggressive as possible. But I think one of the mitigators there is empathy, that I don't necessarily, I when I interact with people, I'm sort of constantly aware of the fact that they have a life too, and that they're trying to go through it to the best that they can. And I think that that's part of what you're saying is, or I hear you saying, is that there has to be a recognition of that as we go through our day, that it's not good enough to just take deep breaths and to try and relax. We also have to be aware of the human beings around us who are trying to accomplish their own things and trying to accomplish their own goals.
Lovely. So let's not forget, and it's hard to believe, but anger serves a purpose and does have benefits. Talk to us about these benefits.
Yeah. So when it comes to studying anger or any emotion, I really approach the existence of emotions from an evolutionary perspective. So I think about sort of why do these exist, and in some cases it's really obvious. Something like fear is very obvious. Fear is one of the ways that our brain alerts us to the presence of danger and encourages us to avoid that danger. With anger, it's actually very similar. It's one of the ways that our brain alerts us to injustice, and it encourages us to confront that injustice or that unfair treatment. And so it basically says, it's one of the ways where our brain says, hey, you've been wronged, and here's a whole bunch of energy to fight back. And that's when our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, our heart rate increases, we start breathing heavier, and that's all sort of preparation to respond. And when it comes to sort of what is the upside then, because one is or the positives. One is just that it's giving us this energy to fight back. The problem, of course, and the thing I don't typically advocate for, is actual literal fighting back. That I think that we can channel that energy into more positive, pro-social ways of responding. And so this is where I think you see that you can channel your anger into protests. You can channel your anger into political activity, other political activities. You can channel it into art or literature or music. You can have assertive and sometimes uncomfortable conversations with people that serve to sort of work through a frustrating situation. That there's all sorts of positive pro-social ways that you can channel that anger. And that's really, when it comes back to the diagramming of an angry incident, part of what I encourage people to do is to think about that that final piece, which is, okay, now that I'm angry, and maybe I've determined through this process that I'm angry for a good reason, that it's a healthy anger is a healthy response to this situation. What do I do with it? What do I do next? How can I use this? How can I respond? Is it smart for me to suppress it? Usually not, but there might be times where that's maybe the best thing to do given the circumstances. Usually, I think the answer is going to be to channel that anger into something valuable.
I think this just reminded me of a story, and I don't know if it's a legend or a real story, but I think the if I hope it's correct, but there was a founders of Stanford University, I think, had gone to Harvard, and they refused to I forget if they wanted to donate money or they wanted to create a specific program, and so they just went and started their own university. So yes, I think sometimes a rejection can be channeled in a way which leads to something more productive and maybe enduring. uh,
Mhm.
so does anger look different in children, and does anger change with age? Is this simply a process of maturation, or can it get worse? And lastly, in the same vein, does anger look different in different genders?
Mhm. Yeah, all really, really good questions. And so I really love to think about emotions from that developmental perspective, because we do see anger. This is one of the reasons we know, or one of the reasons I don't necessarily like to talk about anger as a quote unquote secondary emotion. And that's because we see it very early on in life, right? We see very, very young children, experiencing anger when they can't get to something they want, right? Usually when
Goal
their goals
blocking,
are
yeah.
blocked. And one of the ways they actually study this is, yep, exactly. So probably they don't necessarily have the concept of injustice yet or unfairness, but there is a sense of this thing that I want is out of my reach. And one of the ways they actually study that is by putting things that infants want or children want out of their reach and seeing how they react. And so as the child's cognitions develop, their thought processes develop, they become more able to um, recognize injustice, become aware of unfair treatment, and their anger response becomes, I think, more nuanced and more thoughtful. Um, while at the same time, though, they become more able to express it, and we see that happening because one is they become more sort of their verbal skills improve, also because some of their physical abilities
Hmm.
increase, right? And so they can do things now that they couldn't do when they were little. They can make a fist. They can hit someone or push someone, and so those lashing out behaviors have changed too. Um, Over time, and so much of this depends on kind of development, and not just development, but learning. Um, you know, what people become angry about changes, and we start to see more nuance there as kids develop. We also see kind of the appropriateness of different expressions becoming developed, and that my kids know it's not okay to hit. They know it's not okay to push, and they know it's not okay to say cruel things to people. But there are other kids who learned something very different from their caregivers, who were literally taught, no, it is okay, and that is a way you handle these situations. Or maybe they weren't taught that explicitly, but it was modeled for them, and so they learned that. And so all of that is linked to sort of how anger can grow and look differently in
Hmm.
different people over time. Now, to your question about gender, which I think is a really, really interesting one, the the data we have would tell us that um, that men and women and all the genders don't necessarily experience anger at different rates. And what I mean by that is different intensities. And what I mean by that is that we don't really see gender differences in how
Hmm.
often people become angry. What we do see is some expression differences. So we see men are more likely to express it by yelling or physically. We see women are more likely to suppress their anger, and that really has a lot to do with learning and with what we see as rewarded versus punished. A lot of the research shows us that men are typically rewarded for their anger, whereas women are much more likely to be punished for their anger. They're more, and by punish I mean have their opinions minimized and to be thought of as lower class and lower status.
It's so interesting that I think you have a dedicated section who gets to Be Angry, and it's such a powerful read. And I'm sorry we don't have a lot of time to go through it, but one thing that I'm so glad you clarified this, a myth that anger in women is different quality than that of men, or women, or rather depression is in women is a sign of anger turned towards themselves, which is not true. And a lot of studies talk about that clinically depressed women have higher levels of anger than non-depressed women. Right? And so I
Right.
think it also, to me, leads to poor treatment, like treatment outcome, because you're not going to address it if you don't even consider this is an issue. So it's such a myth that we need to really tackle as a society, as we tackle mental illnesses in general.
Right. Well, and I think it'd also be fair to acknowledge that women in the United States oftentimes have a lot more to be angry about, right? When we think about injustices facing different groups, and we see all sorts of, we see wage disparities, and we see other social pressures, and so on, that the notion that men would be angrier than women seems actually kind of far-fetched to me. But I do fully recognize that the expression of anger is looks very different, or has looked very different for a long time.
And if we use the anger framework, where lack of fairness, poor treatment, and goal blocking, fundamentally people who are oppressed are likely to have more reasons to be angry. But then people who are doing the oppressing have less reason to acknowledge it. And so this power dynamics that is uneven further creates a acceptance of who gets to be angry, right? And you write
Yes,
beautifully about that.
that was beautifully said. What you just said, I that is exactly right. So we've created a society where we have a marginalized groups given lots to be angry about, but then their anger is essentially used as a rationale to minimize their position and minimize their experience. And so it is a anger is a valuable experience that energizes people to confront injustice, but at the same time, the society we currently live in does not like it when people confront those injustices. And so then there end up being consequences to the angry person. And so it's ultimately it's just more systemic unfairness is built into our system. And ultimately, one of the things I've shared a fair amount of on TikTok is how we have used emotionality, not just anger, but emotionality in general, as another tool of oppression.
Absolutely. And that's a real brilliant, like giving attention, because last year, as we talked about George Floyd's death and riots, there was so much protest calmly. That was like a very big movement. Or don't cause property damage. Like there's a way to achieve the goals you have. No, those goals have not been achieved because they have not been heard. So as we talk about the real meat of this substance here, which is, are there effective tools to manage anger, and are anger management programs effective for controlling anger?
Yeah, real quick, I want to comment on what you just said about George Floyd too. Is that
Oh yes, please.
those protests, which I was proud to be involved in, were a lot of the motivation for writing that chapter. I was working on the book last summer, and in the midst of all that, I watched the way this was things were unfolding, and was saddened and angry and mortified and all sorts of things, and felt inclined to add a chapter, and so reached out to my editor to ask for some more time to get that. And I'm so thankful I did, not just because I think it's a good chapter, but more importantly because I learned so much in writing it, or more importantly to me. Um, as far as your question about tools to manage anger, I think that those programs work when they're good programs. I think that is a key caveat, and that there are going to be differences in success rates because of how those programs are developed and what they focus on. I think when programs focus on the types of thoughts people have, when they focus on anger, frankly, the way I think anger should be focused on, I think they can be really valuable. I do think a caveat, one of the issues we have with anger that we don't necessarily have with other emotions is a person's willingness to engage in therapy. Most people who are sad don't want to be sad anymore. Most people who are scared or anxious don't want to be anxious anymore. And that's true for some people with anger, but for a lot of people with anger, they don't necessarily want to let go of it. They don't necessarily see it as their problem. And so working with them to get through that, what we call the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage, and into an action stage of wanting to do something about it is an important part of the therapeutic process.
And I'm not sure if I'm right about this, but I do think that keeping anger is a showcase of power, and you get to look powerful, and it's a way to really keep people away. So I can see that tool feels very viable, feels very useful, and also you get to appear superior. Because the minute somebody's angry, everybody becomes more timid because nobody wants escalation,
Right.
And
Many people who are angry because it has worked for them for a long time. Especially people who tend to be angry in that outward aggressive way. It is, and when I sort of put work in quotes because I don't think it's actually working for them, but it accomplishes a short-term goal often enough that it feels like it's working for them, right? So the angry boss has employees that don't make mistakes or don't cross them because they don't want to deal with their anger. The angry parent has kids that stay away from them or because they're scared of them ultimately. And so that power piece really, really plays itself out there. But ultimately, it also means kids that are scared of you are kids that aren't necessarily healthy kids, right? Employees who are scared of you, that's not a great work environment in a lot of other ways. And so, I definitely think it's linked to power, and that's part of the reason why it's hard for people to give it up.
Yeah, and as we end, I do want to talk about the role of forgiveness in anger. One of the colleagues you write about, Nathaniel Wade, he says that forgiveness interventions seem to be very effective at helping people not only cope with anger and work through those negative feelings, but also move the person to a better place of acceptance and even human flourishing. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are your thoughts about forgiveness? Can people learn to truly forgive?
Right. Yeah, I think we started out talking about how anger has a bad reputation. I think forgiveness also has a bad reputation, and that's not to say that I think everyone needs to be able to forgive. I don't know that that's true, and I've certainly talked to many people, especially over the last 6 months, who I think have undergone things that would be awfully hard to forgive people for. But that said, I think one of the ways that forgiveness is misunderstood is that forgiveness isn't for the offending party. It's for the offended party. It's good for them. And so if you're wronged, and the reason you should forgive is not because it'll be good for the person who wronged you, but because it'll help you recover. And so I think some of that comes from people not necessarily understanding what forgiveness is, that it doesn't mean you're reconnecting or rekindling a relationship with someone. You never have to see that person again still. It simply means you're replacing your negative, hostile thoughts and feelings about that person with more positive thoughts about that person. I think it's really hard to do. I think for some people it might feel impossible or something they don't want to do. But I think for people who can embrace it, it has a really positive, health and psychological outcome for them.
That brings me to my last question, which is about spirituality. Amma, she's Mata Amritanandamayi. She is one of the enlightened spiritual masters from India. And in one of the recent messages, who has dedicated her life to service and love, and she preaches the message of, become the person who has nothing but love in your heart. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, which makes a noble person out of you? And that requires, of course, a lot of self-work. But recently, one of her quotes in which she says, our problem is that we identify with all the moods of the mind. When we are angry, we become angry. It is the same with fear, excitement, anxiety, sorrow, and happiness. We become one with that emotion, whether it is positive or negative. We identify with the mask, but not the reality. None of these moods are really you. Your true nature is bliss.
That is so I'm going to approach this from both my sort of scientific analytical side and my I don't know, my softer side, I guess. My softer side says that's a beautiful quote, and I like it a lot. My more analytical side wonders and often asks myself and others, what is our true self? How do we know who we are? And I honestly, I don't have a great answer to that. I say that because, and part of the reason I think about this as much as I do is I will hear people say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. I was just really angry." And I think to myself, but you said it, right? It has to have been in there somewhere. And maybe the anger turned off your filter. Maybe you did mean it, or you meant a version of it. You just normally wouldn't have said it. And so all of that is to get to the point that I do think that sometimes when we are afraid or scared or sad, it does turn off a filter and actually can reveal who we really are in some ways. That said, you started this out by saying you wanted to ask me about enlightenment at the end. And so I've had that in the back of my mind this entire time we've been talking. And I think in some ways, for me, enlightenment is about, what does it mean? It means being in touch with what we are feeling and why we are feeling that way, and having those things be as closely rooted to reality as possible. Having those things really be connected to a true version of what's going on in the world, or as true a version as we can identify.
I love that, coming from a scientist, and I'm so grateful you revealed some of your softer side too. My take, if you indulge me for a second, is
Please.
I think the part where she says we become one with that emotion, whether it's positive or negative. So I think if many strategies you have talked about, and the work that I have done, and also many other people have read, if we do engage in self-distancing and recognize I am not my emotions, and to me, your true nature is bliss, is that inner gentle self that can be and is able to free themselves from the miserable thoughts and feelings that are generated. And coming back to this initial framework that you shared with us, fairness, poor treatment, and gold block, the true self in that sense, fairness is a two-way street, poor treatment is two-way street, and gold blocking is two-way street. So enlightenment to me is to really become aware of others' desire for the same things, and we're in places where you're failing them. And so that to me is enlightenment.
I love that. That's really, really interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your generosity and your beautiful mind, and the way truly it's been one of the most influential books. And I will share with our audience the link to your podcast and to your book. As we end, I'm always interested in this beautiful mind of yours to see what influences you, what has shaped your thought processes, and what do you recommend that our listeners really follow up with that? Do you have any book recommendations for us?
let me think for a second. I have been, the person that, because at my heart, the thing that I am even more than an anger researcher is that I am intensely curious. And so I want to know about everything. And so I would say my greatest influence from when it comes to nonfiction is Mary Roach, who has written a lot of, she wrote the book Stiff, Spook, Packing for Mars, Bonk, Grunt, and I think there's one called Gulp that I haven't read yet. And she is hilarious. She is brilliant. She is all sorts of things. And I have learned so much from her. And so it isn't specific to anger, but it is frankly the kind of thing that by reading one of her books, you learn a lot about that subject, but you learn a lot about other subjects as well. And so I think that's the thing I would encourage people to read.
I love that. I think, I meant to do that, but I think I might have to have you come back and talk about curiosity, because that's such an interesting topic to me, and I love it. And every opportunity I get, I feel this is one of the emotions that or state of being that we have not nurtured, or we don't encourage enough in our children. So really appreciate those recommendations. So that brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you so much, Ryan, for being here with us today and sharing your wisdom. To all the listeners, thank you for joining me. And if you love what you're listening to, please share. Be sure to comment. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. And be sure to really introspect and keep an anger journal or diagram your anger. I think that has helped me tremendously. So thanks again for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. Anytime.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full PreFrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.